Today we're going to talk about dialogue comping. Here I've made a parent track and 4 child tracks. I decided to make 4 child tracks because I recorded 3 or 4 takes of each line. I need to drag in all of the recorded audio files. I'll drag them all onto the single audio track here and click single track so that all the audio files import into this single track. My track has been automatically renamed to the same name as my first audio file, and I don't need that, so I'll go ahead and delete the name. And now I have all my dialogue in. I can see visually that each one of these audio files has 3 lines in it. We've got 3 lines there. Looks like there was probably a little mistake here at the beginning, maybe a cough or breath here. Here's 3 more lines over on this audio file. Looks like they started saying their line messed up, started over again. So as we can see, each one of these audio files has either 3 lines in it or 3 lines and a couple of false starts or mistakes. Now that we've imported our audio, we need to get it into a format that's very easy to edit. To begin, I'll be using a tool called Dynamic Split. Hitting Shift-D on my hotkey setup pulls up the window. There's quite a few settings here. I strongly recommend looking up another resource to learn about Dynamic Split. I'll be covering just the very basics here, but I'm not going into a lot of detail. These dark spots in our selected audio files represent the parts of our clips that will be trimmed from Dynamic Split. The white sections are the parts that will be kept. You may need to adjust some of these values a bit, but here's a short explanation of what these generally do. Dynamic Split uses a gate that allows audio to pass through when it's above the threshold, in my case, negative 24 dB. And right here we can see that the audio here was above negative 24, and so the gate allowed this sound through, thus turning it white. Then, once the audio has dropped below the hysteresis value, in this case negative 30, here we can see it's dropped below negative 30, and it makes another cut, thus closing the gate on the other side. If a section of dialogue begins with a very quiet syllable, for example, the S sound, it is very unlikely that the audio will be louder than our threshold, and thus will be left out. To fix this, I've added a leading pad of 100 milliseconds. This moves the gate to open 100 milliseconds before audio passes the threshold. This drop-down menu indicates what action will be performed when I click the split button, in this case, splitting the selected items and removing the silent areas that have been split. I'll click the split button, and now all the silence has been trimmed out. I can still see my mistakes, though, have not been cut. We can hear that the actor began their line, but for some reason decided to stop and not complete the line.
We're on 2-3 right intersection.
So there's where they actually started the line, and this here was just a mistake. As I'm cutting this dialogue, I will want to remove those mistakes and just keep the actual lines themselves. Alright, let's start at the beginning. I'm going to move my playhead about 2 seconds in because I'll be matching all my audio up to it, and I don't want my audio butting right up to the beginning of the session. I just find it a little bit easier to edit with a little space at the start. I generally select items by right-clicking and dragging so that I can marquee select. It will select whatever is inside the box. If I select an item or several items, it will unselect any item that is not within my selection. Unless, of course, I'm holding the Shift key. So I'll go ahead and select this first part because I know it's a mistake.
Ready whenever you are.
That's actually me talking to the voice actor, letting them know that they can start when they're ready. I'll highlight this item. In my hotkey setup, if I hit Q, it will delete whatever item I'm currently selected. I know that in this recording session, each line has 3 takes. Now, in some sessions, I may record 4 or 5 takes if they're needed. I can generally tell just from the visuals of my waveform what 3 takes are for the same line. They look the same. If I was struggling with this, or I didn't know how many takes were in each line because maybe it changed, I could just use a custom action to put some space between each audio file. I personally have this action under my radial menu, under Transform, Reposition Item. This is reposition selected items. I can reposition by the start or by the end of an item, and in this case, I'll go ahead and put 1 second in between each item. There is now 1 second between each of these items, and after I've split them, it will be even easier to tell which section belongs with which group. Going back to where we were, I put my marker at the 2-second mark, and now I'm about to run a custom action that I'll walk you through real quick because it's a little bit confusing. This custom action first grabs any items that I've already selected and explodes those items onto the tracks below them. For example, if I select these 3 items, it will take the second item and move it down 1, and it will take the third item and move it down 2. Next, the start of the selected items will be moved to the edit cursor. After that, it moves the cursor ahead to the end of the items, and then moves it 1 second farther. I do this because I don't want the next set of lines that I'll run this same process on to smash into the lines that I just did. There are other variations of this sub-action right here that work in different time increments. So if you need more than a second or less than a second, you can swap out this line for one of those other variants. Instead of doing this manually, let's go ahead and run the action and see if it works. I'll highlight my 3 clips and hit my hotkey, and it runs the action. I can delete this little mistake here that I don't want, highlight the 3 files, click my button, and we're good. It looks like I only had 3 takes for each line. I did not end up utilizing this 4th track down here. In some cases I might need it, some cases I might not, so in this case I can just delete that track. We're about to check out another custom action, and this one could be created with fewer steps, but this is the only way that I've gotten it to run without any hiccups. So you may have more success making it simpler or in another way, but this is the best way that I've gotten to work. The first thing that happens is if the transport is playing, it's paused. The next thing that happens is the edit cursor moves to the position of my mouse cursor. Then it unselects all tracks and unsolos all tracks. The item under my mouse cursor is selected, and thus the track that that item is on is also selected. And that happens because my track selection and item selection follow each other. So if that's a setting that you do not have enabled, you may need to look into that. Potentially, a step could even be added within this custom action that checks if items and track selection are linked together. I always work with item and track selection linked, so I do not have an extra step within this custom action that does that. Next, the solo is toggled for selected tracks, and since we should only have 1 track selected and we just turned all of the solos off, it's effectively just turning the solo on for our selected track, and then finally it plays. The reason that I inserted this pause at the beginning and the play at the end of this action is because in the past, it would move the edit cursor to the mouse cursor like I want. That's great. It would unselect all tracks, which is great, but then when it unsoloed all tracks and the transport would still be playing, just for a brief moment, it would play sound from every single track in my session. And so if there were 30 tracks, then for just a very brief moment, all 30 tracks would be playing audio. I've bound this custom action to Alt-S, so whenever I click Alt-S,
November by the runway, see the,
I can very easily and quickly audition each of these clips and decide what takes I like the best.
affirmative, cross.
Now, what if I don't want to just pick a single take? What if there's certain parts of each takes that I like?
Cessna on November by the runways here. Cessna on November by the runways here. Cessna on November by the runways here. We don't see the, Cessna on November by the runways here. We don't see the, Cessna on November by the runways here. We don't see the,
I like this first part here the best for sure, so I'm going to split my item, and let's run another custom action. I personally have this action bound to Alt-A. What it does is select the item under my mouse cursor. I had selected this item here, but I didn't need to. I could have left the original item selected because in my custom action, it's selecting the item under my mouse cursor. Next, I'm using another custom action I wrote just to put a time selection to my selected media item. If I have my mouse cursor here, this media item will be selected, a time selection will be around it, and then this track only will be selected. The items will be copied and only the parent track will be selected, meaning now this folder track here will be selected. Then the items will be pasted to the parent track, and it will be pasted within the time selection that was automatically made earlier within this custom action. And finally, the time selection will then be removed because it's no longer needed. Pressing Alt and A, since I'm hovering over this media item, will copy it to the parent above.
we cleared to cross straight ahead. Are we cleared to cross straight ahead on November?
I definitely like this last take the best, and so I will split it and hit Alt and A to copy it up to the parent track again. I have an issue here though. If I attempt to listen to the parent track with the Alt-S method I've been using,
Cessna on November by the runways here.
Since I soloed the parent track, it had also automatically soloed all of the children. What I usually do is I mute all of the child tracks, since using solo automatically overrides a mute track anyways.
Here, we don't see the by the runways here. We don't see Cessna on November by the runway.
I can comp exactly the same, and when I'm ready to listen to my final product, it works.
Cessna on November by the runways here. We don't see the, are we cleared to cross straight ahead on November?
What I really like about this style of comping is since these top two clips here aren't going to be perfectly lined up, since a voice actor will never do exactly the same pace as they did before, I can easily take this line from this track and the line from this track down there and move them, and now they can work together.
You don't see the, are we cleared to cross straight ahead on November?
I've been putting a little bit of fade at the beginning and end of each of my audio files. Now, this is something that you could automate if you wanted to. I'm doing it by hand here, but you could select all of the audio files, hit F2 to pull up your media properties, and then inside of media properties, you've got your fade in and fade out values. You can just punch in whatever time you want. For example, maybe 0.08 for your fade in and fade out. After you hit OK, all of the fades that were already created in those audio files will automatically snap to that time, and any files that did not have fades on them already, those fades will be created. There's something very important that I forgot to include earlier in this video. Right after the dynamic split step and before the actual comping, you need to highlight all of the audio files on one of your tracks. And then we want to run a custom action called Create Markers from Selected Items, name by take source file name. You may notice that I'm running this action as a sub-action of my own custom scripts called SpeedComp Item Select, and this is because in the past, I had multiple steps that were running within this action, but at this point, I only need Create Markers from Selected Items. You may or may not need more or less. When I run this action, it takes all of my selected items and puts markers at the very beginning of them. It names the markers the same as the item. For example, here we can see this marker name matches the item that's directly underneath it. This is a great way to quickly find where my audio files are within the session. If I pull up the region marker manager, I can see here where each item is. This is super helpful in large projects. If I need to find line 60, for example, rather than listening through each line and searching around by hand to find it, I don't have to do that. All I have to do is type in 60, and then line 60 will show up. If I click on it, my cursor jumps right to the marker.
Ma'am, I'm trying to advise you that we're on an active runway.
Note that this only works if all of your audio files are already named and named properly based on what line they are.